Welcome everybody. Thank you to the organizing committee for trusting me with chairing. And I'm excited to be part of this session this morning. And so we have 4 papers, and today's session, we're in panel 24A, and today's session is entitled Modern Slavery and Exploitation, Work Regimes in the Global South and the North, and Work, Multiple and Different Intersections. Thank you to Dr. Shobha Arun from ManMet for organizing this session. I think it's very important work, and we appreciate your efforts, Dr. Shobha.
And Wendy, it's Wendy
and
too.
Wendy, thank you, Wendy. Wendy is going to be singing for us when we have time at the end. We start with Joyce and Patrick, the most respected woman on this panel, as we've heard that she works with her husband and co-publishes with him. So let me tell you a little bit
and the marriage survived.
Yeah, absolutely.
Survived the peer review.
There you go. So modern slavery and exploitative work regimes. So what this panel looks at is we're exploring forms of modern slavery practices in the South and the North. And we are looking at, the papers we're looking at today are initiatives such as the Bangladesh Accord on Safety and Work, and how it makes a difference to workers in global supply chains, and how do these initiatives impact in reality. So the precarity of female migrant labor, and a case study from Bangladesh and Nepal by Professor Joyce Wu and Professor Patrick Kilby. So Professor Joyce Wu is a lecturer in the School of Social Science. She's also a Fulbright scholar and deputy editor of Development in Practice and visiting fellow at the Australian National University. She has a diverse history of interdisciplinary research and practitioner experience. Her research includes sexual and gendered violence in conflict and post-conflict situations, intersectionality and inequality, gender mainstreaming, sustainability development, climate change, and equity and diversity in higher education. Prior to joining academia, she worked at the Australian government and the UN on gender and development issues. And Joyce is also part of the Australian government-funded research individual deprivation measures, such as multidimensional poverty measures with gender sensitivity. Dr. Patrick Kirby is an academic and convener of the Master of Applied Anthropology and Participatory Development Program. His research interests are NGOs and their accountability, gender and development, managing international development programs, and most recently, the story of foreign aid. He's published 2 sole-authored books on NGOs, one dealing with women's empowerment and Indian NGOs, and in 2015, a history of the Australian Council for International Development. So we have quite a formidable team here. So we welcome you and we give you 20 minutes to present. Can I ask all other speakers to switch off your camera, me included, so that we don't have any buffering while we have our papers? Thank you. And I will just give you a thumbs up when you have about 5 minutes left, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. And so Miriam, that 20-minute includes the Q&A time, or the Q&A
no,
is?
We have Q&A. Yeah, we have Q&A at the end of the 4 papers.
Oh, okay, that's excellent.
Okay.
We had planned for 50 minutes, so we may not pad it all out, but we will.
No, if you have 15 minutes, that's fine. We'll just use it for questions and answers. I'm sure there'll be lots of it. Thank you. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so just double checking, can everybody see the screen share now?
Yes, we can.
Ah, perfect. Okay. Yep. Okay. So, all right. Welcome everybody, and thank you, Miriam, for that very gracious introduction. Although you gave me a bit of promotion, and in that I'm not a professor yet, but I hope to get there one day. And so our presentation today is titled Precarity of Female Labour Migrants, Case Studies from Bangladesh and Nepal. And we will also actually talk about some of the challenges that we encountered as a result of COVID-19 and conducting data collection whilst navigating through those challenges. But before we begin, firstly though, we would, and this is an Australian tradition, is the acknowledgement of country for a non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. If I am, say, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, it would be a welcome to country in terms of welcoming you all into my country, in terms of into my tribe's ancestral land and so on. But as a non-Indigenous person, I am providing an acknowledgement of country. And so from where we are in Maroubra, we would like to acknowledge the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land in this area. We like to pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous participants who are present here today. And also importantly, that the sovereignty of the Eora Nation and the traditional custodians of this land in Australia more broadly as well, the sovereignty has never been ceded. If you have the practice in your local context of acknowledgement of traditional custodians, please do feel free to put the acknowledgement country in the chat box. So in terms of this research background, this research is part of the bigger and global gender-sensitive risks and options assessment for decision-making road to support work and freedom phase 2. And WIF2 is a UK government-supported international labour and organisation program. And the ILO program seeks to reduce vulnerabilities of trafficking and labour exploitation of migrant women in the care and government sectors, particularly in the Gulf countries. And so this road, the gender-sensitive risks and options assessment project, is comprised of a very global cohort. So we have people from New Zealand, from Bangladesh, from Lebanon, from India, from Nepal, from Canada, and Australia as well. And in terms of, it's a very global research collaboration over 3 years. And you will also hear our colleagues' research later on in the conference. I believe a tomorrow session, you will hear from our colleagues in terms of the more broader perspective as well. But for our presentation today, we are focusing around the issue of precarity and migrant women. But before we get into the topic of precarity and migration, we want to visit on this very sort of contested and often visited topic on migration and empowerment, and particularly, the extent of empowerment that which migration offers for female migrant workers. And historically, the debate and the literature on women's international labor migration shifts between that victims or heroes debate. They're either victims of trafficking, or they are heroes of their circumstances and they do good, right? And it's a very binary sort of representation and also discussion. Whereas I think contemporary-wise, that debate has shifted to a more nuanced understanding, in the sense that women migrant workers simultaneously find migration experiences empowering, but they also face aspects of exploitation, violence, and vulnerability, and those experiences very much hinders on their intersectional identities. By intersectional identities, I'm referring to Kimberly Crenshaw's notions of class, levels of education, ethnicity, geographical locations, marital status, age, and so on. And so how those intersectional identities are then meeting the confluence of global labor migration is very much important in whether women experience exploitation or empowerment, or both at the same time. And so in that regard, from that backdrop, we're very interested in the nexus between gender empowerment and precarity, and the concept of precarity in how it shapes women migrant workers' experiences. So, you might say, well, what is precarity then? Well, the concept of precarity within the migration context, so this has been a concept that's been developed over the years. So we're not the pioneer there. We're standing on the shoulders of those who have been refining and working on those ideas. And precarity is sort of broadly defined as a condition of vulnerability to social, political, economic, environmental events and shocks. So in the sense that how a cohort is able to respond to shocks is dependent on the positionality where they're situated. And in terms of the notion of precariat, it's an amalgam of the terms precarious and proletariat, and it seeks to explore and understand the global norm of contingent employment, social risk, and fragmented life situations. And I think Guy Standing's work around the precariat back in early 2010s really sort of brought to light, but also subsequent authors, writers, and researchers have built more complications. And so in other words, precariat is a class of workers with insecure income, hireable on demand, available on call, exploitable at will, and fireable at whim. But at the same time, precariat is similar to female worker migrants, portrayed as villains or heroes in populist discourse. And I think we have heard this in Britain, in Australia, in America, in terms of that concept of migrants coming in and stealing jobs. Patrick, so I've been sort of feel free to jump in at any time.
I will jump in, but now you're on a roll. So carry on.
Just trying to make it participatory. So the initial plan for our research methodology, we had it all nicely planned out. We're going to go in and talk to stakeholders, communities in both Bangladesh and Nepal, very much on qualitative focus, but the global pandemic shifted everything online. And we rapidly realized that particularly for migrant or prospective migrants or returning migrants' perspectives in terms of safety and privacy, it would have been very hard to conduct these types of qualitative interviews over the phone, and especially for women who are located in remote areas. Internet, Zoom, and so on is not it is not simply not feasible. And so we had to reshift and rethink our strategies in terms of data collection. And so we focused it on interviews with key informants, but also bearing in mind that the limitations of our focus thus far that is until borders have been, lifted, it's safe to travels globally. We have this research findings have not yet captured the voices of the female migrant workers. And so this is a caveat that I really want people to remember.
There is an opportunity, hopefully early next year, when things settle down in Australia, Bangladesh and Nepal, is that rather than us go, there may be an opportunity to use local researchers who we can have conversations with to explain the research, so that they can do the research and then report the findings back to us, and we can consolidate it that way. Which, even though we love very much spending time with local communities, but this enables local researchers to have greater ownership of this. So there is one of the few bright sides of this situation.
Yes, definitely. It removes the Westerners out of the context in terms of building, and also not just maybe not about building, but giving room and giving space for local researchers to have that opportunity to conduct those data collection and give acknowledgement where where it should be. So just briefly going into Nepal and Bangladesh context. So Miriam, how are we doing with time?
You're good. You still have 8 minutes.
Oh, that's
okay.
good.
All right. So, okay, well, we'll just go through this quickly. So in Nepalese context, the Nepal overseas migration is very much hidden because of the attempts by the government to try to limit or ban women's labor migration, 2017, and again, very recently in 2021, early in 2021. And the migration ban is ostensibly about protecting Nepalese women, but has been criticized for its paternalistic attitudes towards women. So rather than trying to support female migrant workers, critics have said, it's about trying to control women's livelihood opportunities. And in terms of the context as to why Nepalese women migrate overseas, is that there are less attractive livelihood opportunities within their country. So 1/3 live on less than 2.3 pounds a day compared to earning 290 pounds per month in Gulf countries, working in care sector, for instance. So hence majority of Nepalese women migrant workers are undocumented. And so ironically, government trying to have this law to protect women, but at the same time, it creates illegal migration and trafficking, because women still sees this as opportunities, as a way out for better income choices, particularly for female-headed households. In terms of Bangladesh context, similar to Nepal, women are also attracted to overseas migration. Short-term migration being the preferred option, namely Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Cooperation Council. Higher number of women in migration, and Bangladesh government has pre-departure training, but from our discussions with the key informants is that it's out of touch with women's realities and needs. And so how the notion of precarity comes across is that what we found consistently with the literature, as well as with key informant interviews, is that the idea of precarity in terms of vulnerability to cope with shocks, which then leads to trigger decisions towards trafficking and also unsafe migration processes, that exists at every stages of the migrant woman's journey, and also what we call different sites and locations. And what we mean by that is there's a lot of research done to look at the work exploitation and abuse of migrant female particularly female domestic workers in Middle East. But what's absent in a lot of these analyses is that how those spaces, locations, and sites in both the destination country and the pre-departure, the origin countries, create or have these, is precarious in a gender-specific manner. And this affects the changing opportunities that women have. And so in return, this contributes to unequal and unfair migration process, work experiences, as well as women's experiences of returning to their home country and the repatriation. And so we argue that the different locales or the different stages in which women move between those different migration stages from origin to host country are very gendered and intersectional. And the precarity of those different spaces very much produce different experiences for individuals. Patrick, did you want to add anything?
I think the issue is a lot of analysis don't cover the complexity of the household situation at home. So it could be poverty, it could be household debt, it could be gender-based violence, but also there's often just an argument. People just want to see somewhere else and get out of the place. And so the driver may not be that clear. But of course, the problem is that where they go, there is a similar set of household restrictions imposed, particularly if they're first-time migrants. Now, many of the migrants actually do what they call circular migration, where they repeat the migration up to 3 or 4 times over 10 or 15 years. It's the first migration where the problems, where it's most toughest. But once they're there, they learn language, they learn networks and stuff, and more comfortable in subsequent migrations. But regardless, it is still illegal or semi-legal. And so there's always a certain amount of dare I say, bribes being paid or fees being paid to a number of people. But even then, it is still worth their while. But as we come to the next slide, when something like COVID hits, then that throws everything.
I haven't finished.
Yes.
And so, for example, migrant women may leave their home and community, as Patrick mentioned, due to precarity brought about by poverty. And poverty could be due to climate change, natural disasters, or land tenure issues, or in the case of Nepal, inheritance issues and laws which are not gender equal, or also domestic and intimate partner violence, but also could be about women wanting to have overseas experiences and that, that desire to see the outside world and gain different experiences and knowledge. And so if, say, the home space is precarious and unsafe, in the sense of domestic violence, for example, then women may use migration work as a means to escape. But then during the migration process, in that process of, going to the agents, applying for visa and so on before relocating overseas, for instance, migrant women advised in Bangladesh are advised to go through government and non-government organization provided pre-departure trainings, as well as other preparations. But again, these can also become precarious spaces because in our discussions with the key informant is that sometimes those pre-departure trainings are not designed to cater specifically to migrant women's needs. It could be too generic, or it could be too, time. Okay. And so in that sense, there's precarity in different stages. And so we have to think about how does precarity in the different sites interact and then produces vulnerability or empowerment. In terms of how COVID changes the situation, for many, it's made precarity worse. So in the host country, work has dried up and host families may be unable to pay, for example, house domestic workers due to loss of income. We know that in Lebanon, for instance, domestic workers don't just work as domestic workers, they also work in the restaurants or in the shops of the owner, of their employer. And so if the host family's income has reduced, then their employment circumstances also decreases substantially. Cramped living conditions, again, creates vulnerability. And even when they are back home, most are stranded, but even when they're back home, so for example, in Nepal, we've learned that there are often lack of quarantine facilities, and so women are told to isolate at their own home. And that then creates stigma within the community about perceptions that they're bringing diseases into their hometown or village. And that then they also face a stigma of losing their job and the flow of remittances to their household. And so in conclusion, what we argue is the concept of precarity and how space or locations are precarious is a useful way to analyze the push and pull factors for migration, for trafficking, but also could be opportunities for empowerment, and that migrant women's experiences are very diverse, and that they cannot be categorized as a binary of either or, heroes or villains, empowerment or exploitation, but rather we have to look at the intersectional and power relations of these different spaces and how they operate. The COVID pandemic has brought new challenges for migrant women, and therefore we argue that countries need regional policy collaboration, particularly dialogue and collaborations between the host and the destination countries. Destination countries in terms of recognition of migrant women's labor contribution to the host organization, but also origin country in terms of providing gender-sensitive support and repatriation.
Just a final thought, this is going ahead a couple of years, is I don't think the short-term migration of women's migration will return in the same way as it existed prior to 2020. There'll be a situation of coming to some stability. People won't be able to move unless everybody's vaccinated, and the whole situation of COVID is understood and stabilized, and then incomes have to return. So that's another part of this narrative. Just to, to conclude in thinking ahead a couple of years.
So with that, we thank everyone, and please get in touch if you have any questions.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So we move on to our next presentation. Our next paper focuses on household poverty, ethnicity, identity, and exploitation of young migrants in Ghana. And Dr. Joseph Hassan is a faculty. Dr. Joseph Hassan is a faculty member at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. He's the Associate Director for Political Economy of Sustainable International Development at the Center for Global Development and Sustainability. He was an assistant professor in development practice at Trinity College in Dublin and has acted as associate director for Masters in Development Practice. Dr. Hassan has published extensively on migration, exploitation, and development, and has spoken on several academic papers, conferences. Welcome, Dr. Hassan. Thank you for being here with us. I will put my hand up when you have a minute left. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. I'm going to ask all those in attendance to please switch off your video, and we'll just allow the speaker to have video on so that there are no breakages. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and very grateful to have this opportunity to share our initial findings on this series of analysis that we are conducting within the context of the Ghana Living Standard Survey, and looking at various thematic issues with this particular emphasis on household poverty, ethnic identity, and exploitation of young migrants in Ghana. This study relates to the historical context of migration or internal migration in Ghana, which has traditionally followed a north-south pattern, of course, following our historical and colonial roots, where under the British colonial rule, the northern part of Ghana was predominantly underdeveloped, unfortunately, and most of the development and economic activities took place in the south. So it was a pattern for young individuals, particularly labor-seeking as a mechanism, and also, of course, for adults and everybody else who might possibly live up north and may want to seek other opportunities maybe beyond agriculture, because the north has traditionally been our agricultural resource hub, producing various crops in that respect. But over time, this pattern has shifted from being a pattern for maybe adults looking for other opportunities to predominantly large numbers of young individuals. So this study sought to understand the differences in terms of demographic characteristics and also the issue of ethnic identity with regards to young migrants. Ghana has several ethnic groups, and of course, we have always considered the fact that young people from the north move down south, similar to the conversation on Nepal, etc. And we consider these traditional patterns to hold even as situations and our societies and economies evolve into different forms. So traditionally, on the general streets of major cities in Ghana, you often have the argument that, oh, young people from this part of the country come down here to look for work. And also, there's not been much work in terms of intellectual analysis of individuals who migrate, particularly within the context of youth migration, and those individuals, those youth who do not necessarily migrate and are resident or they're nascent in the sense that they live and work or find work within the particular locations where they are or they were born. We also sought to understand the issues related to human security and welfare implications associated with the labor seeking mechanisms of young migrants. And then we try to understand the diverse nature of our potential or actual exploitation, because in the past, as described in other literature, migrants are often perceived negatively. And so when something negative happens, it's often ascribed to the migrant. So even the idea of a migrant being a victim of a form of exploitation or a negative tendency is often not necessarily investigated or sometimes overlooked because it is considered to be the other way around. So we thought of understanding that dimension as well, which I will elaborate in the course of the presentations. This is a general snapshot of recent economic development activity in Ghana. In general, Ghana is doing well economically and socioeconomically. Of course, I mean, unfortunately, with the advent of COVID, things have changed for that matter. Also, a recent observation, which is not necessarily on this slide, is the fact that inequality is considered to be increasing for that matter. So I thought of mentioning that as we go on. So with regards to the study, we try to focus on young migrants, and then in the context of youth within our demographic health survey and the National Living Standards Survey, we consider individuals within the youthful population as being between 15 to 34 years. So I'm using the same definition in that respect. We're using the Ghana Living Standards Survey data set, which is a national representative data, which is well used both nationally and internationally by leading institutions like the World Bank and IMF and etc. We also use it for our state of the nation and other forms of analysis. So it's a well-respected data set. And we try to do a comparison with some of these variables between the 2012-2013 data set and the 2016-2017 data set. So that's where that's the basis for our analysis in that respect. With regards to analytical methods, we do a lot of quantitative analysis with respect to the data set, and then also I try to complement it with some qualitative interviews and focus group meetings on the ground, which I will present on a slide. So, well, I will skip some of the methods for now in interest of time, and then we can talk about that if somebody is particularly interested. But I just want to acknowledge my postdoctoral fellow Dina Charisma, who helped me with the analysis as part of our work in the center. So, with regards to our findings, we observed some very interesting patterns, which some of which are not necessarily following the traditional observations or the traditional arguments that I have previously described. First of all, I would like to mention that we observed that increasing pattern of the qualification or educational expectation of these migrants. Previously, it often was individuals who sometimes maybe are not educated or are not sufficiently educated or have basic education who often go out there looking for opportunities. It used to be a pattern of individuals looking for agricultural activities, wanting to work in cocoa farms, etc. will move down south to the forested area because the northern part of Ghana, the northern regions of Ghana is predominantly savanna in that regard. But this has changed, I mean, with individuals becoming more and more educated in terms of the migration pattern. And then now we have observations of maybe increasing pattern of college graduates in terms of individuals moving. We also sought to understand the notion of benefits, and then also the nature of employment that individuals who seek this form of labor activities with regards to migration and within the context of youth also are often offered, because that has not necessarily been examined to a large extent, because most research or previous studies have often focused on the informal sector, which is often, or the agricultural sector, which attracts a large number of individuals. So we looked at both formal and informal to understand the dynamics in that regard. And this is a broadsheet of some of the data and variables. We can talk about some of that if anyone is interested. But with regards to poverty and the idea of migration and in relation to the probability of being poor, and then in comparison with comparing the two groups of migrants, young individuals moving from where they are born to different parts of the country, in comparison to individuals who are also seeking for similar economic opportunities and have not actually moved, we noticed that some individuals with regards to young migrants became more likely to be poor compared to their non-migrating colleagues or counterparts, especially those from historically poorer regions. And here we also look at ethnicities with regards to, because we've had cities where we've established that understanding of geographical dimension, but when it comes to the details with respect to the different ethnic groups or the different associated ethnic groups, there isn't much knowledge as to who and why and who benefits and who doesn't benefit, etc. So we try to dig into that. And we noticed that some of these traditionally poor ethnic groups are also, unfortunately, sometimes likely to be poorer as a result of migration. Probability of being employed also offers diverse findings, contrast to what is traditionally often believed, in the sense that we notice that the employability of some migrant groups decrease faster compared to their non-migrant groups between the two data sets. Migrants from the poorest region and ethnicity experience the most significant drop in their relative employability rates compared to the non-migrants. So the idea that individuals are coming from somewhere to take maybe our jobs, even if it's within the same context of a particular country, I mean, in this context, is often that we disagree, because that is not necessarily the case in that respect. Also, there has often been the argument that most migrants would predominantly work in the informal sector. So we try to examine that as well, because the informal sector also often its own challenges, likewise the formal sector in that respect. So we realized that perhaps many young migrants are less likely to work in the informal sector, as we observed in the 2013-2012 data set. Most migrants did not necessarily progress as well as their non-migrants. So whilst they were becoming less likely to work in the informal sector, the probability decreased more significantly for non-migrants. So the observation here is that although migrants and also young people are increasingly working in the informal sector because of freezes on employment within the formal sector with regards to public sector, and also we have a much smaller private sector as a country, we notice that some local, in terms of non-migrating young people, tend to be more likely to work in the private formal sector compared to the informal sector. And non-migrant also progress particularly faster than migrants from poorer regions and also ethnicity. So we still have that inequality consistently persisting in spite of migration. The migration patterns have been considered to be potential equalizing factors, trying to maybe open opportunities for one individual, however, where you come from as a country, and also being able to open opportunities in terms of labor for young migrants, however the location, maybe you were born in the country. But we also notice that there is this element of structural discrimination, not directly directed at individuals per se, but the system within which one seems to operate, and that seems to work against young migrants. So most migrant youth working in the informal sector have often observed to be having better benefits. However, and also access to employment benefits improved in 2016-2017, which is good, because as the economy increasingly become better, you expect that that should be the case. Some of the benefits include maternity leave, paid holiday leave, and also pensions, as well as medical care and also social security. Ghana has a national healthcare system, health insurance system, which allows one to register and then have access to healthcare. And I think some employers are encouraging or paying for their workers to have the national insurance, which is a positive thing. We looked at migration and employment in relation to injury and then risk at work, given the fact that within the informal sector, there is often the reported pattern of injuries or individuals doing highly risky activities, especially for those who are considered to be young or in a youthful period of their maybe development. So injury and risk of being injured is quite important as far as employment and also one's longevity is concerned. We noticed that the probability of getting injured at work declined in general between the two data sets for all groups. But then we also observed that there was an experience of less significant levels of decline, which became more relatively prone to injury compared to, in terms of migrants compared to their non-migrants. These surprisingly include migrants from richer regions and also ethnicities. So there has been the previous arguments that most migrants who come from very poor regions of the country will be subjected to very, laborious and intense labor-intensive activities, and of course they are likely to be, injured at work. But then the observation here is that there is the chance that even those coming from more affluent regions of the country or migrating from one point to the other are also equally exposed in that respect. Likewise, we also made observations regarding abuse and also abuse at work. And then non-migrants experienced less abuse in the 2017 data compared to previous years, which is good. So the level of abuse is considered to have decreased. Conversely, some migrant groups experienced higher levels of abuse in 2020 compared to 2030. These groups also experience more abuse compared to their non-migrants. So migrants from poorest regions always experience the highest level of abuse, which is sadly not corrected, because this has been a historically perceived or reported pattern, and we are hoping that with improvement in socioeconomic well-being in the country, some patterns will change, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Human security was also examined, and in this case, we're trying to look at migrants' possibility of being victims of crime within the areas that maybe they live, or the communities or the neighborhoods. And many migrants will live in peri-urban locations because of cost of living. And here we notice that whilst we see progress in terms of economic betterment, in those living in areas reported to have often crimes, those living in areas with crimes reported to be very often, as reported, as indicated in the red and blue highlighted numbers, had a slower progression. That also means that for migrants, the look where you live has significant implication with regards to your potential progress as a labor-seeking migrant or individual, young individual working in a maybe urban area or peri-urban area. That crime had an implication in how one was able to perform in that respect. Likewise, we also saw the same with living standards and living locations. So, I mean, I will quickly go through some of the qualitative findings, and we notice that migrants often have to find accommodation in sometimes market stalls. Some of them end up sleeping on pavements, on cardboards, etc. And then they wake up in the morning at dawn and then get back into their various work. We have situations where both different gender groups were sleeping or will spend the night in the same premises or in the same limited confining area. Some of them were living in sheds and wooden structures, etc., due to high cost of living in the cities, particularly where they cannot actually afford to find their own areas of accommodation. There are also exploitation by both men and women, individuals who control the migrants, sometimes their housing, sometimes their rent, sometimes their wage, sometimes their life overall. And then there was the observation of trafficking as well, unfortunately, which often culminates in different forms of exploitation, including sexual coercion, sometimes threats, and then sometimes financial demands in that respect. There was also the observation of sexually transmitted infections, and then the predisposition to drug abuse or misuse of drugs, or particularly with regards to opioids, because several of the migrants work in very labor-intensive activities and they resort to using painkillers as a way of minimizing or reducing their body aches and pains, and then that becomes an addictive over time. We don't have any significant programs for drug addiction, so that's a very serious concern in that regard. And then unfortunately, we also have pregnancies, unplanned or unexpected or unwanted pregnancies, which often leads to ostracization of individuals. They can't go back home from where they came from because they are not considered socially or culturally accepted because of the fact that they're having children with outside a formal relationship, etc. So this also creates its own socio-cultural dynamics within individuals and then household setting. So in conclusion, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we still observe various forms of structural exploitation within the migration systems when it comes to young migrants in the country. There's been improvements when it comes to offers of benefits and associated benefits associated to employment, which we'll say hopefully has been due to education of more educated migrants. Young migrants being involved in the mobility patterns seem to also allow individuals to negotiate or maybe navigate better labor employment options. And of course, people become more socially aware and increasing social justice debates in that respect. And again, we also see that there is an increasing level of education in terms of qualification when it comes to individuals migrating. It's no longer school dropouts or basic educated individuals, but individuals all the way to university graduates are also participating in such mobilities. The formal sector employment, of course, seem to be doing well, but we still have a very small formal sector, which then means that large numbers of individuals will have to seek alternative employment in the informal sector. So with regards to policy recommendations, I recommend the potential use or revisiting of geographical targeting of poverty reduction initiatives. Ghana has social protection programs, but currently the direct social protection programs, which is the LEAP program, is targeting individuals from 65 years and above, more for individuals within the pension range or individuals who are technically qualified for pension, but maybe were working previously in informal sector initiatives that are not necessarily on formal pensions, and also living within a poverty bracket. But then geographical targeting is likely to help reinforce the idea of reducing inequality and also helping move people out of poverty, especially when poverty is very geographical in that regard. And then also the potential application or introduction of soft skills within the education system or post-education systems, because currently using manual labor or depend on manual labor is not sufficient to earn an individual a decent income when one migrates. So having skills that will allow one to either work as part of a team or a group, or work in a way that one can apply some form of educational skills or technical skills, however simple that skill might be, will allow migrants to seek labor options outside the basic maybe labor or wage, or maybe individuals relying on manual labor, but then into more applied skills, which will then hopefully open doors for these migrants to have more progressive educational, employment options, or be able to maybe even further their education as part of their migration strategies in that regard. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. You can write you can take note of your questions, because we're going to have some time towards the end. Our next speakers come from the University of Manchester and the University of Essex. Dr. Shaila Ahmed joined Essex Business School as lecturer in accounting in September 2016. She graduated with a PhD from the same university. She's also been a lecturer at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, and her research interests are interdisciplinary, and her research relates to corporate governance, accounting and accountability practices in emerging economies. She is co-presenting and co-authoring the paper with one of our conference organizers, Dr. Shobha Arun, who has extensive experience teaching sociology and international development. She's the senior fellow of the HEA, and she's an active and enthusiastic academic, and a substantial her research goals are to better understanding of processes of global change, and she's doing some amazing work with migrants and women. Her publications have impacted policy reports, scholarly debates, and IT-based services within gendered labor market. Welcome to our colleagues. Their paper will be drawing on value trap slavery. Welcome, Shaila and Shobha. You have 20 minutes. When there's a minute left, I will switch on my camera and raise my hand. Thank you. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. So I'll just start off and hand over to Shaila in the interest of time. I think we might want to finish within 15 minutes to give the last speakers more time as well. So I wanted to start off with the not new observations, the centrality of economic sectors operating as global chains in development, which is staggering, with figures on employment, workforce, and growth. As everyone knows, the garments industry comprises of large number of workers, which are mostly women. Statistics show that there are nearly 60 million workers employed in as vulnerable, marginalized, low-paid, and impoverished forms of work. So such sectors are seen key for economic growth and employment. For example, the sector is the major driving force in Bangladesh's economy, making up 83% of the country's exports, and in terms of employing 20 million people, mostly women. Now, since the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse, the whole world started asking questions. And so the ensuing Bangladesh Accord has been seen as kind of a game changer in the garment sector. And many studies have also reported the changes some good, some positive, some not many positive as well. So, but still in 2019 figures show that according to the Global Slavery Index, Bangladesh is still within the 5 countries within the largest estimated number of people in conditions of modern slavery. In the UK as well, a report submitted to the UK Parliamentary Committee notes how labor regimes are bound up with the broader structural dynamics of global supply chains, which we cannot deny, which mirrors forms of practices that we would say is akin to modern slavery due to a range of exploitative practices. Now, this is just not alone to Bangladesh. Even in the UK, there are concerns about the safety and dignity of workers in Leicester's garment industry. So despite many new measures, such as the Bangladesh Accord, and calls, for example, changes in consumer behavior, the creation of practices like clean clothes campaign and many others, there are still, we see workplace practices that flout regulations and continuing exploitations. We see evidences of stakeholders in many contexts come together to bring change to such practices, but much is unknown about this, and this is where perhaps our work brings about significant evidence. There's been a number of significant work, for example, that of Stephanie Barento's work on global production networks, the connections with labor agency and gender relations that examine the linkages and tensions. So that is so, dominant with the commercial dynamics of such dominant firms and their societal embeddeds in diverse localities. So I don't want to go too much into all of that because that's just, it points out to the position of lead firms within such analysis and how it affects the engagement across the supply chains with workers and social actors. And it is in this context that the Modern Slavery Act has brought about such a change. Let's go to the second slide. That's another slide, Shaila. Yeah, and this is where Shaila takes on to show the significant turning point and the importance of the regulatory context and how the positioning of supply chains and efforts in terms of transparency requirements. So I'll hand over to Shaila to present this work.
Hi, thank you, Shobha, and it's my pleasure to be able to present today. Just to relate with Shobha, she presented the global context and also the Bangladeshi recent regulatory context and changes in labor regime. This paper, we kind of link this Bangladeshi context with the recent UK legislative movement, particularly Section 54 of the Slavery Act, which requires big organizations in UK to publish reports, slavery reports, and to make it available in their website. So this type of legislative reform, particularly transparency reporting, is appreciated in the literature. In accountability literature, it is seen as a favorable approach to deal with slavery. And also it is praised in the sense that it pushes up the agenda to corporate board level. So in that sense, this is appreciated. But in this research, we kind of try to problematize, this in the sense that we try to understand the gap between these UK corporations' disclosures, what they are disclosing in the reports, and the experience at the ground level of exploitative practices in the supply chains, particularly looking at the Bangladeshi experience of slavery. So we try to understand if the current state of slavery disclosures, they provide an informed basis for stakeholders to demand corporate accountability. We see that self-reporting, we kind of so problematize these self-reporting practices of big corporations and looking at the experiences and perspective of local stakeholders. Now, in terms of method, We conducted field visits in 2016. So it's kind of like post Rana Plaza context. So you can see lots of, in terms of Accord Alliance, lots of changes are going on. So we try to study some export-oriented, 100% export-oriented faster factories which directly supply to UK companies. And so we also want to see what these companies are saying and what their suppliers are doing. So that sort of thing. It was very difficult to establish the link, not only in terms of time frame, but time frame of reporting, and time frame of our data collection, but also challenging in terms of none of these companies, they disclose their supplier's location or supplier's name, So it becomes and that is also one of the limitation of this study, and not very sure how we can address that. Then we also conducted some interviews with local stakeholders, so mainly factory owners, supervisors, managers, mostly male managers, workers. Most of these workers are migrated women, because this is garment industry is totally feminized in terms of operating, operating side. So these machine operators, they are mostly women. We also conduct interviews with auditors, social auditors. They are mainly independent auditors. We conducted one by a representative, and NGO and civil society members. We also look at some documentary evidence consisting of both published and unpublished reports. So just to fit in the context, what these companies are saying in the report. So I just present here two of the snapshot, Mother Care and Next, what they said, what they're doing in terms of addressing slavery in the report. So what we did in the paper, we analyzed the slavery statements of 10 UK companies. And just to summarize what they're in terms of measures taken to address slavery, most of these companies, they are, they subscribe to some form of code of conduct, and they are conducting audit. And so this is kind of like most of these companies, if you see, they're saying that we are buying from audited factories, and these factories are regularly audited, and there is corrective action plans based on the audit findings, and on the basis of that, we manage our supply relationship. So if we see certain factories or suppliers are not compliant, we just end our commercial relationship. So that sort of thing. And in terms of transparency of audit findings, we do not see much these companies are telling us. What they're saying is they're not telling us in their disclosures what type of issues they find through their audit and that sort of thing. So only the measures they're saying that we are buying from, say, for example, bread, or we're not buying from Red or Orange or that sort of factories. We are only buying from green dated factories, so that sort of thing. And also some of them are going beyond audit, and they are also talking about some other voluntary mechanisms, such as roundtable discussion with local stakeholders, so that sort of thing. But in all of these, we will, what we actually try to, make a case in the paper that there is a gap in terms of lack of accountability. So nobody is actually taking responsibility and accountability for this type of slavery conditions and that sort of thing. And there is, a lack in terms of commitment, in terms of disclosure, and in terms of the real experiences taking place on the ground. So in account, because I'm from an accounting background, so I see it from that perspective. So we say that when companies disclose their reports, that is one form of accounts of what is going on. But at the same time, there is alternative forms of accounts, and we can see these alternative forms of account in terms of media exposure, in terms of activist report, in terms of research, academic papers, professional papers, reports, and that constitute the alternative accounts of certain reality. So here, in this paper, the UK Modern Slavery Act, they define modern slavery is defined very broadly. But for the purpose of this paper, we try to narrow it down. So we mainly focus on forced labor and child labor. So how in garment factories, we see it from the value trap slavery perspective, something which Crane suggested and wrote about. So we try to understand how forced labor is taking place and how this is reported and experienced, and what is the gap. So you can some media coverage about forced labor in Bangladeshi garment sector. So very recently, Clean Clothes Campaign, they win a lawsuit against Lidl. So there's so it bans the Lidl's advertisement motto that we trade fairly. We also see some, debates about whether this type of exploitation, does it constitute slavery or not, and that sort of thing. In the media, we saw that there are reports about working conditions, particularly in terms of excessive working hours for women and that sort of thing. Alternative accounts also comes from our own research. So we conduct some interviews with local stakeholders, those auditors, those workers who have to go through this suppressive control regime every day. So the audit reports and the corrective actions plans, which are very confidential documents, of course, they reveal that we find that traces of overtime, gender-based labor process or control, extra hours of unpaid work, cutting of break-off times, child labor, absence of grievance mechanisms. These are kind of like explicit in those audits and corrective actions plan. Just a snapshot of a particular audit report which talks about child labor. So the auditor recorded this in the social audit report. Then what happens is that based on this, there was a corrective action plan which the supplier provide to the buyer, where it says that they have now introduced some mechanisms so that unwanted people will not be in the factory premise. Then in the next audit round, this factory was seen as compliant. Then in the next audit round, they again complained about this type of, so the auditor suggested age verification system. And then the factory come up with the idea that age verification system is not possible because many of these workers, they don't have birth certificate or they don't have national ID. And then they ask for some time. So after the next audit round, then the auditor again said that there are child labor and that sort of thing. And then the factory come up with an innovative idea. They say that this part of the factory is no longer, so in the printing section, you will see the child labors, printing and dyeing section. So then they came up with the idea that the printing and dyeing section does not belong to this factory. It's in the factory premise, but the owner of this section is different. So actually it's the same owner. So he has, one factory for compliant, for showcasing, and he has 3 other factories which are mainly work as subcontracting. So what I'm trying to say is that for various reasons, these suppliers, they find some ways to play with these audit rules and regulations. And the reality of despite all these mechanisms that we are legislative reform and we are seeing, the real impact of forced labor and that sort of thing, workers are facing this on a day-to-day basis. So it's kind of like we see lots of lucrative reports, but in the underground, these type of practices are normalized on a day-to-day basis. So, and in the audit report, how these are normalized or justified. So these are issues that are seen as something which will be, this is a problem area and this will be developed in the long run. But what happens is that these actually persist in various ways. So, and as I've said, that alternative accounts is not only the reports, but also what people on the ground, how they see it, how they justify it. So their experience of a certain phenomenon is also constituted as alternative account. So here we see what these, various buying representative, buying house manager, and auditors, NGO leaders, factory owners, how they are, justifying or seeing these things. So exploitative business model. So forced labor is seen as part of, global business model of fast, which is described as fast fashion business model. So companies continually, change their fashion product, and they give a very short lead time. And cost target for production. So this is kind of like the impact of this is that these workers, they never have scheduled production deadline. So what happens is that when a factory owner, supplier, they get a buyer, they just take the order, and then on the basis of that, they come up with a working schedule, which requires, tremendous flexibilization, and this type of forced overtime, excessive work hours, gender-based violence, this comes as the process. So, and we will see that in the KPI, key performance indicator of these foreign buyers, they actually talk about, various factors, but in terms of actual measurement, there is little effort from their part. So this is, the first one is the local buying representative of a foreign buyer. And what they said is that as local buying representative, they are given very tight cost target. There is some social, compliance, slavery condition, and that sort of issues, but these only are seen as reputational. So as a representative of placing orders, he just have to ensure that there is the condition is not bad enough to affect the reputational threat. So as long as there is no reputational threat, so this type of slavery and this type of conditions doesn't matter. So that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, there is also, as we have seen, that there is some lack of shared responsibility and lack of a stakeholder engagement. Although many of these companies, they're saying that we are locally arranging roundtable discussion with government and policymakers. But what happens is that in none of these stakeholder engagement program, the reports are not shared. So these companies are kind of like just saying that these are the issues and you have to make local policymakers have to, make a conducive environment to address this and that sort of thing. But there is a real lack of, shared sense of accountability and responsibility there. So when we compare the alternative accounts and the accounts disclosed by these companies in terms of how they're addressing slavery in their supply chains, we see that forced labor is instituted by, gender-based control, holding wages of female workers in areas, often their national ID cards, these are, retained, bullying, various types of gender-based violence. And there is also Human Rights Watch report in 2015, whoever raises their head suffers the most, which actually talk about how unionization is threatened in the Bangladeshi context. So we try to understand why these are taking place from the perspective of value trap slavery. So the supply chains, they are tapped in a vicious cycle of meeting buyers' demand for shorter lead times, strict delivery standards, cost targets, and also accompanied by huge compliance pressure. So I was reading a report which says that after the Rana Plaza tragedy, what happens that many foreign buyers, they take this as a, negotiation tool Overall 30% price, there is 30% price cut following the Rana Plaza event in Bangladesh.
Can I, Shaila, can I please ask you to round up because we have one more paper?
Yeah, just another 1 minute should be fine. Yeah. So, so the cost recovery is achieved by squeezing wages and production targets, so temporary contracts, and forced labor is kind of just an outcome of all this process. Through so what we mainly tried in this paper is we tried to empirically reveal that transparency disclosures like the Modern Slavery Act one in their current form, although they are very important, but it's not enough in terms of addressing these slavery conditions. And often these end up in camouflaging the reality and while driving slavery and other types of slavery like abuses underground. So thank you. I look forward for questions once we end the next session. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaila and Shobha. Thank you. So our next speakers are Wendy Olson and Jia Kim, where they'll be speaking about excessive work hours of child laborers in India using recent time data. Jia Kim has recently joined as a lecturer in social statistics at Manmet University. She's a PhD candidate at the department, and she's passed her Viva Link last week with a thesis titled Bayesian Child Labor Estimation and Predictions in India. Wendy Olson works as a professor of socioeconomics at the University of Manchester. She is head of the Department of Social Statistics. Her research in development studies, sociology, and economics includes applied statistics, and it covers employment, informal work, gender, labor markets in India, South Asia, more broadly, and in the UK. She's created new designs for mixed method researching quantitative methods. Welcome, colleagues. We look forward to your paper. I'm going to ask our other colleagues to switch off their camera, and our two speakers can switch on their camera. You have 20 minutes. I will switch on my camera when you have a minute left to go. Yeah, you please unmute yourselves and go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm unmuted. Unfortunately, it's not possible to release my camera.
Okay.
So I feel bad, really. Could the techie please look at that?
Kim, can you unmute yourself, please?
That's done now. So GA is going to begin the presentation of our paper.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Wendy. Would you like to start because of time, and then we can continue how it is?
Was that I hoped that GA might be sharing the slides. Would that be possible from your end, GA? Otherwise, I can. Would you like me to share the slides?
Yeah, I can share yours, and then I will share.
Okay, I'll share.
Yeah,
so I'm just bringing those to the fore here. You guys can comment if you think it's not the right thing in your window. But that should say the excessive working hours of child laborers. Is that correct?
That's correct. We can see that.
Oh, excellent. It's such a relief and so happy to be with you today. G.A. Kim is now Dr. Kim, so congratulations to her. And she has a paper published with us in the Child Indicators Research. So we'll show you that reference. But that's not containing this material. This is new material. And we're very grateful to University of Manchester for hosting our research. Here's an outline of our paper. We have specific research questions, but we're using a new data set for all of India. It's a very good data set by the looks of it. And our method is to explore alternative measurement methods using that new data set. So it's really quite a general paper, hoping to take up issues that many people in different disciplines are interested in. And still at the same time to focus on exploitation. So near the end, we'll be focusing particularly on extreme forms of exploitation as measured through time use, And so I'm just going to give the background, and then GA is going to continue. So the child labor amount in this survey from 2019 is carefully spread across all the months of that year. It is higher than what was recorded in 2011. Of course, there's been population increase since then, so we would have to look more closely at rates, but it's not going away. And for a structuralist like myself, you know, I'm a sort of soft structuralist. I'm looking at this in terms of social classes, ethnic groups, especially ethnic minorities, and the social reproduction patterns, which are to some extent by gender and class. So in that light, we thank the Indian Institute for Delete Studies, which has been hosting our joint research. We have a number of colleagues sharing research on the time use data. And we're really grateful because they do continually focus on ethnic and class differences and gender in India, in the IIDS. So the recent studies of time use have pointed out that reproductive work cannot be ignored, including domestic production, unpaid services, you know, cooking. It significantly increases the time that is spent in these studies. And the same is true for girls as it is for adult women. So the gender division of labor is starting very young, like 5. And the ages in this study are 5 to 17. So you'll be able to see that. We also have previous research finding that mothers' times spent in the unpaid work could make the child's attainment in school lower. What we found in this study is very interesting, is that if the mother has more attainment of her own, then the child's likelihood of being in child labor now in 2019 was lower. So it's good for women with education to be thinking their girls shouldn't be just doing child labor, and their boys. But at the same time, that sort of begs the question, you know, about mothers' education and mothers' unpaid work. Because if this is a whole cycle of reproduction of unfairness in the modern economy, they need that education. So we're sort of committed to the view that we don't mind the children working a little, but not too much, and not in hazardous occupations, which is shared by the ILO and UNICEF. Further background on the gender and development approach, it would stress the socioeconomic groupings, the regional differences in wealth, which are very much urban-rural differences in India. Lots of detail there about demography and debt bondage, but there's not much time for that. I did want to acknowledge Indira Hurway's important work. She published a series of papers on the Indian 1983 data set. It was 1983, so it forms a baseline showing these very long average hours of work for boys and girls in the occupations shown on this slide. Indira Hurway actually set up the system of categories and the convincing arguments in favor of a time use survey, so that we now have the national time use survey. The figures shown on this slide are from about 6 major states in that past year. So what we're finding is the hours of work are horrendous for some of these children. And if you have 27 hours as the average, you've got some of them working over 40 hours a week, which is considered hazardous by everybody. The differences of opinion, though, are, just let me go back. There is a difference of opinion about domestic work. So for the UNICEF, domestic work should be included, and we would have to add to these hours any time spent on domestic work before deciding whether the child was being harmed. Whereas for the ILO, that's not considered legitimate, because the domestic work is not considered to be included in the national accounts. It's a satellite account. And so we're experts on all these nuanced definitions. We're prepared to offer competing percentages, but really we're convinced that the domestic work matters very much and has to be measured carefully. So therefore, we've offered 3 alternative measures from this data set. Yes.
I'm sorry, we are still looking at your first slide.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can show you those. Is it now showing the change of slide?
Yeah, good.
Is that showing the change of slide?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, that's good. Okay. So when I had it on full, it wasn't showing. And when I didn't have it on full, it was showing. So that's going to help us, GA, because I'm soon going to finish and you're going to speak and you can tell me to change. So is slide 6 showing?
Yes.
Thank you kindly. So here we have 3 definitions that we've applied in looking at this large data set. It's a 1-day recall data set for all adults and children in all the families sampled across India. And the definitions we've applied are a conservative definition, which is probably how the Indian government looks at that data set. And it considers only the first mentioned work activity. A medium view includes the secondary or third work activities, if these are actually work. So your secondary activity could be a leisure activity, like watching TV while doing the cooking. But if it was another work activity, then we've included it in the medium view. And the literal view allows simultaneous and non-simultaneous tasks. And I think it's a question of how much time we attribute within the stint to these activities that distinguishes the medium from the literal view. And if necessary, Jia can explain it again later. But the thing is that the literal view is a little bit more lavish, but it turns out that the medium view is the one that stands out. If you allow for secondary or third activities, which are work, including domestic work, you do get a higher level of child labor. So I'm going to let Jia talk a little bit about that and then move to the results. Would you like to start, Jia? And I'll change the slides for you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So
Sure.
we are, as Wendy mentioned, we using these 3 measurement types: first, conservative, medium, and literal. So, oh yeah, as she mentioned, in medium view, we counted as long as there is any type of work as major or secondary or third type of activities, we counted it. But we don't allow duplications. But in this literal view, so we focusing on this simultaneity of activities. If these are simultaneous work, we just times by number of activities. And then if it's non-simultaneous, we just divide it by number of activities. So which is like literal view. And so our data set is so next page, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's Indian Time Use Survey 2019. It's very meaningful because it's first ever data covering all India, and it provides all ranges of activities and covering very large populations. But you know, they just excluded the children under age 6. So we just now using these age groups over 6 to 17. Right. Next, please. I'm sorry. Yeah. So here we provide a definition of child labor. This is a mixture of like international standard as well as our own time threshold. So the first threshold indicating that at least 1 hour per week of economic work for ages 6 to 11 from ILO 2017 scheme. The second guidelines from ourselves is our own time threshold. We found this 38 hours using model. And then thirdly, we use the 21 hours rule for unpaid household services work for ages 6 to 14, which follow the UNICEF 2019 guideline. Yes. So the next slide shows this time threshold, how we calculated the 38 hours. We found this, if children work over 38 hours and their risks of being out of school increases so sharply, so we decided to use this time threshold, which is now from another paper. It's under review. And the next,
yeah, that's the unpublished paper, and this threshold was calculated across all the age groups from 6 to 17. Okay.
Yeah, this is I'm going to show like how our time, this 3-time measurement system affects the count of child labor first. And as you can see here, like the medium view extends the number of counts very significantly. So for example, conservative or literal view suggests maybe 7% of children worked as laborers in 2019, but in medium view, we see there is a 7.5% who worked as laborers in the same year. So, and then there is a difference by males and females. I'm going to explain. The next slide shows that, yeah, it confirms the difference between these measurement types. And as you can see, these conservative literal view are not very different actually. However, the medium view is clearly different, and it shows this mean number as a 7.5%. It's a large number. Yeah, the next slide shows a little bit of desegregation. It's by age and gender. And so this difference by these measurement types clearly occurs in the ages 11, 12, 13, 14. So you can see that this blue bar is actually higher than the others. And this difference, we believe, is from the domestic areas. So usually, like when children could do multiple activities when they do unpaid household services. And when they mentioned they do a little bit of like rest and then doing also a bit of unpaid household services. So there is like mixture of activities. And that this type of secondary and third activities could significantly for girls. So this increase probably from girls. And the next slide. So yeah, this is another disaggregation of child labor rate by state and gender. And between the medium or literal view, there is not too difference. However, you can see in the female child labor rate, Chhattisgarh could have 13% of child labor rate in a medium view. However, it can be like 11% in the literal view. So there is a difference. And Odisha has a 10% of child labor rate among females if we take a medium view, but it doesn't appear if we take a literal view. So now here I'm moving on to the times, so the laboring hours of child laborers. So we compared using this three measurement system and looking at this economic activity and unpaid household services. And economic activities including their working at home for production. So for example, fetching water is also included in the economic activity. And then we confirm them there is not a significant difference in economic activity hours by this measurement system. However, in unpaid household services, so this medium view really increases their laboring hours. So on average, children could work about 3 hours a day for economic activity and 2 hours a day for unpaid household services. So in total, they work about 5 hours a day. So how long do male and female child laborers work? And you can see the males could work about 4 hours in economic activity and 1 hour for unpaid household services. And this pattern is really opposite for girls. Girls could probably work about 2 hours for economic activity and then 3 hours for unpaid household services. And then in total, there is a difference. Boys could work slightly longer than females in general. Yeah, so from here, I'm going to show these 3 graphs, so the disaggregation of time use by gender, age, and social groups and type of their work. And in this graph, you can see here these age groups, age 15, 16, 17 have really high number of hours of working. So their times reaches about 10 hours. And even about like 8 hours for boys. So these adolescents working really long hours. And economic activity, you can see there's a slightly gaps between boys and girls, and boys, working longer than girls in economic activity. And of course, in unpaid household services, and females were working longer than boys. In the next slide, we can see the difference by the gender and social groups. And so it doesn't generate much difference between social groups. However, there is very salient high increase in number of hours among Muslim non-SC/ST. So especially boys spending about like 7.5 hours a day in work. So there is a clear effect from these social norms and cultural background, and as well as gender. And then the last graph shows, the next one, please.
Which slide do you want? I'm on 19.
Yeah, 20, please.
20.
I'm sorry, 19. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
19 is fine.
Yeah, 19, is extreme working hours we can see in agriculture and non-agriculture. So those children usually, age over 15, and they are working as laborers in agriculture and non-agriculture. And as you can see, girls working about 10 hours and yeah, boys working about 8 hours in agriculture, and also they working huge hours in non-agriculture sector. And then nextly, we just focused on these extreme working hours. So page 21, and so now we just considered the children who are working over 10 hours a day, so regardless of this time thresholds we defined. And then we found these children, among adolescents, really spending long hours as laborers, agricultural laborers or non-agricultural laborers. So we can see like high proportion of children are found in those sectors. And the cases shows that, for example, the casual laborers children, yeah, who's spending like 14.5 hours a day. It's like a massive number of hours in spending our work. And another case showing the boys working as a regular wage worker in motorbike shop, for example, and working 10 hours a day in work. But in this case, boys do not have unpaid household services. But it's not only the laborers, also like domestic workers, for example, like female, yeah, who is 14 years old, spending 12 hours a day for domestic work. So they are not just laborers, but some are domestic working at home. So the conclusion is now there are approximately 7% of children work as laborers, and it's really harmful for their development. And this is quite a large number than we expect. And our conceptual or time measurement systems quite affect this estimation. And boys could work about 5 hours, and the girls could work about 4 hours a day. And if they are working as if they are ages over 15, and maybe their working hours about 10 hours a day for girls and 8 hours for boys. And we found that the simultaneity does not really affect this estimation much, but the counting the secondary, third position is really important. I found that the simultaneity is not really, clearly revealing the reality yet. Yeah. So then the child labor should be understood as class, social, gender relations, and then there is, of course, diversity. There's not just laborers, some are actually domestic workers. The girls could have like dual burdens. They're working outside home, but as well as they're working always like 2 hours, 3 hours at home. So it really increases their number of working hours. And we found this UNICEF guidelines having a little bit of missing out girls who are working at home and who are over ages 15 and 16, 17, they are not included as laborers because they are neat children who are not considered as child laborers, and which are about 3% of boys and girls, 5%. So which will increase the rate of child labor if we counted these neat children as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all our colleagues, our speakers. It's really been an interesting morning. And I particularly enjoyed all of the papers because we're working on quite a large project with migrants and education. So I've learned a lot, and I will be drawing on your expertise if that's okay. So do we have any questions? One of the questions that I, as the chair, would like to raise, and I find myself engaging in research, but having to almost reinvent what we're doing and how we approach it because of COVID. And so my first question, and it's to no speaker in particular, how have you been not forced? How have you been mandated to realign your research with the overwhelming, pervasive presence of COVID-19 and the impact that it has, the vulnerable impact that it has on women in particular? I'm going to switch off my camera now, And if you have a question, please switch on your camera and ask it. And then, we'll just go in order, and then we'll give all the speakers a chance to respond. Patrick, please go ahead and ask your question. You're on mute, Patrick.
Yeah, my question is to Wendy and Gigi. That survey, in terms of hours worked, I'm just wondering how reliable the reporting is. Like, did the boys overestimate their hours and the girls underestimate their hours, or did the people answering the question do that? Because I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Thank you. Yeah. Shall I answer that one, GA? The survey was actually carried out in an even worse way, that they had one respondent typically for the household. So that respondent was in charge of getting the information on the spot for the people's reference day, which was the day before. And so you can imagine some exaggeration happening according to what's socially appropriate, so it's called social desirability bias. And so in particular, I would have said more for the domestic work, that it's not measured normally. So therefore, they might exaggerate that one, thinking if they think that that's the appropriate work that the girl should be doing, so that it's in a way for them nice to express that she's doing that. So I do worry about possible exaggeration. For the working hours of employment and informal employment, because most employment is not on a contract basis here, 95% is just informally set up, then I think that they probably do have agreed hours and that they know which hours have been worked. But the current time use measures that we have, they do include some activities like travel to work or breaks during work, the lunch break in particular. Now, some people do or don't get a lunch break, and we haven't had time yet to really look and see what difference would it make if we left those two items out. So we're still looking at this massive data set, and the issue of exaggeration is there.
Could I ask a question about, I think it refers to migrants and something that Joseph said about education, and it refers, I think it relates to the first paper as well, Patrick's and Joy's paper, about whether education actually changes or improves migrant status. I'm looking at some of the results and I'm not convinced it does, or I may be wrong. So do we think that educational status actually increases migration rates, and if it does it increase their bargaining power within the destination countries? I think it's a general question to both speakers.
Right, thank you so much, Shoba. If you don't mind, I'm happy to go first, and then we can take it from there. So I think that what we observed in our analysis is that education changes, I believe, the options in terms of the possibilities of one activity from the other, in terms of the labor-seeking mechanisms that one is able to employ as per your educational background. So, of course, education provides wider options. So I think with the widening of the options, some individuals who have higher education are able to go for more either formal employment, which offers additional benefits, in particular with regards to employment benefits, and also with a special interest with regards to maybe women, those who can have maybe maternity leave, maybe paid sick leave, etc. And then compared to those who are not necessarily maybe of a more significantly higher education, who are limited in terms of what they can do, and that brings along the package. So I don't think education possibly changes a lot of things, but it also, in our observation, it changes in terms of what one can pursue, and then consequently the benefits that one is able to derive from. But we have higher educated individuals pursuing both formal and informal employment. So that was quite generally even. But then when it came to contracts and contract employment, etc., we notice that education makes a difference in terms of one's ability to pursue maybe a more contractual based employment compared to maybe the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. For me, it was more, observation, because I've read that, we assume that people will migrate because of poverty, but I believe in the global age of migration, there will be increased rates of migration despite increase in income, or education. So I guess, migration is here to stay, I guess.
Well, in terms of from our study and this is very context specific. And so, for instance, in Nepal, what we found was that women, particularly in the hills region, the access and opportunity to quality education is lower than, say, those who are in the lowlands. And so in that sense, their livelihoods opportunities are also lower incommensurably. But then when you look at, when the women are looking at, their chances of earning a decent wage in domestic work, for instance, in Nepal compared to overseas, they see, well, okay, so overseas domestic work is, so much times higher than in my own domestic country. And so then they make that decision to go overseas, despite, the lower education barriers. And what's interesting is that once they go overseas, some of these women gain the life skills. So I think for the Nepalese context, and possibly for Bangladesh and other contexts as well, happy to explore this, is that the life skills in terms of education, life skill education they gained in terms of language skills, bargaining, negotiation, networking, bargaining with individual employers to get a better pay, for example. Those education lessons serve the woman well, right? Because then they're able to move on from their lower contract to a better contract. But it's different for Bangladesh as well.
Yeah, there's a paradox because in Nepal, because it is irregular migration through India, then there's no hoops to go through. And so being educated or not is less of a barrier, while in Bangladesh, there's a lot of regulatory hoops to go through, and that favors educated people. So there's a bit of a paradox around the role of education.
And how we define it.
Yeah, thank you.
Or do we have any more responses from any of our speakers in terms of COVID-19 and how that's altered the way we engage in research with migrants?
She's interesting.
So we, and thank you, Mariam, for that question. So we mentioned it in our presentation, and certainly, our priority and definitely our ethics, our research ethics is about how to protect the rights and interests of the most vulnerable groups in the research cohort. And so for us, it was about, well, we have a pandemic and we have vulnerable groups who are stressed. And in that sense, we made a very clear decision not to reach out to migrant women, whether overseas or returning, because we cannot guarantee their privacy when we're talking to them. Even though we may be talking to them in WhatsApp or Zoom, or what other social media platform, we don't know who else is listening in the other room. And so our concern is, how do we protect these women's privacies and also dignities and safety? That meant that our research data collection for now has been limited to key informants in terms of service providers. And we recognize that that is a gap in terms of getting women's perspectives. But at the same time, we also recognize that women are in very precarious situation really due to COVID. And so we, it's a conscious decision not to trouble them any further. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, hopefully next year, but it's all in the lap of the gods. We'll be able to get local researchers to talk to the women on our behalf. But
when it's safe as well with the local researchers.
When it's safe for everybody. So, but yeah.
So in that sense, it's not about us subcontracting it to someone else. Oh, this is too risky. You can do it. No, it's about how do we do it in a sustainable and in a way that's capacity building
and respectful.
Yeah.
Okay, Shavita, you have a question? You can unmute yourself, please.
Okay, I have a baby in my lap, so I'm sorry if there's some screaming noise in the background.
No need to apologize for that.
My question is to Patrick and Joy. It's a really fascinating presentation, and my research is pretty much focused on Nepali context as well, labor migration, intersection with trafficking, irregular migration, and so forth. So what I found in my recent finding was I was sort of interviewing women who were returnees from Israel. So they had a very different perspective to what I have been doing for the past 5-6 years, focusing on Gulf countries. They had more empowering experience, like you talked about. They learned the new life skills, there were language skills, negotiation. So now they've sort of used those skills in a way to create opportunities in Nepal after once returning. But in your presentation, you were all talking about, my question to you is, did you focus on destinations, and did you find a difference in experiences when talking to stakeholders, that there are different experiences of precarity in different destinations where women have sort of ended? And what I also found was when they came back, often the discourse are focused on Gulf countries, and hence we have these patronizing, in a way, and sort of laws protecting women from not migrating in a way in the name of protection, which is again harmful, like you've already identified. Women traveled by India, but there are pre-training departures. But what these participants told me was that there's nothing when they come back. So there's precarity within that context as well. So is there something key stakeholders identified? There's nothing at all. So there's no data as how many women have returned back from valid routes. I'm not talking about illegal, irregular migration. They have gone to Israel through government schemes, but there's nothing when they come back. So the precarity lies there as well. So I really like your presentation, changing or challenging the discourse around precarity when you come back, and not just to do with exploitation. Most of the women said that they always focus on exploitation. If they're traffic victims, then stakeholders come in and say, okay, let's do something about it, but not women who've just come back finishing their visa or, to do something. So are you planning to do something on that, or have you found something in the conversation with stakeholders? Yeah, sorry for a long-winded question.
Thank you. Great question. No. I'm going to give Patrick, I'm going to give you guys a minute to respond, because we almost running out of time, and our session organizer, Shobha, needs to have a minute, and also our tech is telling us that she needs to shut down the session. So just a quick minute, please.
Okay. So thank you, Shavita. That's a great question. Our main focus was on Gulf countries and Lebanon. So countries which are in Gulf, which have the kafala system, which is that very much that indentured labor. And so that experience of empowerment is very diminished. In Lebanon, the circumstances are slightly more free in that sense. As you said, women are able to learn life skills. In terms of repatriation, yes, there is a lot of things which are missing out. So in terms of Nepal context, any children, for example, who are born overseas, if they return with their mum, the migrant women workers, if they return with their mum, they're not recognized as citizens of Nepal, even though their mum is Nepalese. And so there has to be greater regional, international cooperation between recognizing, children born overseas and coming back, they're still citizens because of their mother's nationality. We have to respect that. but also recognizing that this kafala system, this intention system, is very harmful, and that it has to be, well, sorry, this is a strong word, but I think it has to be overturned.
Okay, thank you. I would like to hand over to Shobha right now, and thank you all. It's been wonderful meeting you all. I'll let Shobha speak to you and close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. I want to like to thank Mariam for her excellent sharing. You know, I think that we were a bit short of time. We had excellent papers, so not much questions. So maybe we can, you know, perhaps in tomorrow's session, I would like to invite all of you back and also spend some time thinking about, you know, how we want to take plans for publishing forward. So perhaps we want to reduce the number of speaking time, perhaps by like less than a couple of minutes to like 15 minutes. And then we'll have some discussion for the papers. So same time tomorrow, we'll have the second panel, and again 4 speakers. So looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And I think we are just finishing in the nick of time before they shut us down. So thank you all to the speakers, especially to Mariam and the techie team. I think we had no glitches with technology, although it just take time to uploading our slides, isn't it? So
Thank you,
have a great
everyone.
afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.